Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today is episode 57, Friday, May 14th, 2021. As usual, we'll start with COVID Connect, our COVID news. After that, my guest today is Phil Santer with Ann Arbor SPARK. After that, we've got an announcement from our friends at J&J and J Labs that we'll be sharing with you. And May has been Medical Device Development Month at MedTech Crossroads, and we're going to be talking about this inquisitive title, Be Objective, the meaning behind the ceremony. We'll tell you more about what that's talking about as we continue this survey of medical device development topics that we've been going through. I want to thank you, some of you, for reaching out. Our son, who we announced last week, is doing well, but he's back in the hospital this week. So we're doing the second show in a row on very little sleep. So hopefully this goes well, but we do appreciate your being here today. And as we move into our COVID news, all the data from cdc.gov, and in Michigan, the transmission continues to be exceptionally high. Most counties in the state are red. It's really interesting. Someday I want to have somebody come on and talk about why we've been seeing this, but nevertheless, that has not dropped off for the last, I want to say, 6 to 7 weeks now, that Michigan has been a hotspot of transmission of COVID. When you compare that to the rest of the country, many places that are high, but many more substantial, moderate, and even low in the plain states there. As we move over to hospital admissions, this is on a per 100 inpatient beds. You can see the whole country calming down. Michigan had strangely been a hotspot and still ranks last in terms of hospital admissions even this week, again for about the past month and a half. But thankfully that is dying down. That is making its way down. The whole country is starting to look much better than it had been. So we're very thankful to see that, and thankful for all the first responders and healthcare workers who have had to deal with that on a constant basis. Here's the state synopsis. Also more good news here. The wave definitely dropping off in Michigan. We see that the positivity rate, most importantly there, the orange line, is dropping off. And thankfully, deaths, well, not quite dropping yet, but they haven't spiked like they did during either of the previous waves. Again, grateful for that, and grateful for the great triaging that folks in the healthcare systems have learned to do over the course of this last year and change. Here are also hospital admission rates, thankfully dropping off in Michigan. Once again, the older demographic, the one that's not as represented during this wave, which is wonderful to see. It's the 40 to 69-year-olds that are really sadly carrying this wave. And a small uptick also in the 18 to 39-year-olds. But good to see that dropping off, a very clear drop there as well. In the national picture for vaccinations, Michigan is partway down in that list. The highest states, Maine, Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and Hawaii in terms of population fully vaccinated, 50% or more. It's good to see those rolling out. CDC has actually separated this data now into a completely separate page on their PDF. Here you can see the number of doses that have been delivered nationwide, 327 million. That's at least 150 million people, or 45% of the population that's gotten at least one dose. But the rate of vaccinations is dropping off, and that line certainly doesn't show a bottom. The tentative data most recently just continues that trend, perhaps accelerating that trend. We'll see next week. So this, as some news sites have reported, this may be the end of mass vaccinations. We will find out. But certainly we see statewide that there's reports of freely available vaccines for those who want to get access to them. We're also going to tell you today about a role that we've told you about the last few weeks. Into Being is seeking a microcontroller firmware developer. So if you know of someone who'd like to be part of our team, send them our way. We would love to chat with them. You can always send them to info@intobeing.com. Going to remind you, coming up in June, the quarterly pitch party. This quarter, we're going to be awarding $2,500 to one of our startup participants who are going to be pitching for our judges' critique. Our judges, Andy Rader, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, Jim Metzger, Stacy Frankovich. Wonderful commentary from them. As always, we're not really trying to run a pitch competition here because you can't really judge winners and losers. We're really interested in what we can learn about these companies. What cool things have they done? What did they not do so well? In fact, in 2 weeks, our judges are going to come on and they're going to tell us turn-offs, what they don't like, what they find hard when a startup, a generic startup, of course, tells them this or that, and they're going to come on and talk about that outside the context of the pitch party so that we can learn from them what not to do. And then we'll get into our pitches in the month of June, and we'll have the judging at the end of the month. As always, if you want to be part of this or know a startup, a medtech startup that wants to be part of this, just send an email with a pitch deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org with the areas of problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and your ask, or the functionally equivalent areas, and they'll be eligible for participation in the pitch party. They'll get 10 minutes at the end of an upcoming show to pitch their company, and then they'll be part of the judging at the end of June. So we'll look forward to that. Couple more notes, as we've said the last few weeks, you can find all our FDA education topics from MedTech Crossroads at the Into Being website under webinars and under FDA education. So find it there. One last announcement here also, I guess through the month of May we'll be announcing this. Our friends at MEDC are looking for med device companies specifically to participate. They're looking for 6 of them to participate with them at Medical Design and Manufacturing West. It's a great trade show. It's a big trade show. If you're part of a company, it's a great place to find vendors, suppliers, and everybody who's everybody. Apparently it's going to be in person this year, August 10th through 12th in Anaheim, California. And it often has 20,000 attendees. It's a big trade show. They're looking for folks working on med devices in ophthalmic, electromedical and electrotherapeutic, analytical lab, surgical and medical instrument manufacturing, surgical appliance and supplies manufacturing, dental equipment and supplies manufacturing, or ophthalmic goods manufacturing. So if you want to be there, even I think we heard that there might be some grant funds available, but reach out to Tino or to Mark and they would be interested in chatting with you if you think you're eligible to go with them to MD&M West. And with that, that's most of our news for today. We're going to be talking about J&J just a little bit later. But today I want to welcome as my guest, Phil Santer. He is the Senior VP and Chief of Staff at Ann Arbor SPARK, a longtime fixture in our community. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Gene. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And when you and I were prepping for this, so I was staring out the top of Mott's and I was comparing to the background that you're in front of, and I'm like, we think this might be taken in a similar
spot, different times of day, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
When you and I spoke, yeah.
But like so many, we've all had those experiences, and I thank you for your patience prepping with me as I had to run off as the doctors were coming.
Of course.
But Phil, you've been a longtime fixture in the community. You and I were chatting the other day, and you were saying, "Hey, there's this new position we have available. Can we announce it?" And one thing turned to another, and we wanted to talk with you first about you, your career, your role, how it ties into Ann Arbor SPARK, and then this really sets a cool stage because this position that you're looking for. I want a running start at this and how this person that we'll talk about later could potentially help Ann Arbor SPARK to continue its mission. So we'll go through all that. But I think first it would help folks to know, and many people know your name, many people have interacted with you and see your prominent role there at SPARK. Tell us more about your career history. How did you get to this point? How did you come to do this? And we're going to get to the point here of why on earth would you continue doing it like so many in our community? Why are you crazy enough to keep doing it?
Crazy enough to do it.
Give me a little run-in.
It's a great question. I mean, and maybe for those that don't know, so SPARK's an economic development organization. We focus on supporting companies in Washoe and Livingston counties, and we work with early stage companies. That's probably what we're both most well known for in terms of trying to support startups. And then we also work with larger companies that are growing or coming into the area. And I think, as we mentioned before, it's a little bit of a niche, right? Economic development is not something that usually people find themselves developing a career path towards. A lot of folks that are in this industry sort of stumble into it a little bit. And I think I was of a similar ilk to that. And it was, I came at it from the public policy side, actually. I mean, it's kind of where I was interested in not in politics necessarily, but in public policy and in trying to, I don't know, support the ways that people can work together effectively. And I found over time, there's this whole segment of things where there's this interaction between what's going on in the public sector and what's happening with private industry and with businesses and with economics. And I was like, I'm really into that. So I kind of found my way and stumbled my way through, and people have been fortunate enough to give me a little bit of a try along the way and see how it goes. And I've really just sort of developed, I guess, a passion and interest and kind of a role in the economic development world.
That's really cool. It strikes me that there's so many people who, and I think I'm one of them as well, and many folks that we work with in this sort of mid stage. You know, we're all here working on companies in these interesting beginning and mid stages.
Right.
And it takes a certain interest in a lot of different things. You have to like a lot of different topics. It's not, I just want to dive into this one thing. You got to be willing to do that. We didn't talk about this before, Phil, but I was curious, like for all of the startups that are out there and they're saying, okay, I'm going to go interact with Spark. What can you tell us? You mentioned the politics, and we don't want to get in necessarily to partisan politics here, but
sure.
When it comes to what happens behind the scenes, for it to be possible for a startup to be at the receiving end or an inventor to be at the receiving end of Spark's services, right? You guys do boot camps, you do some supplementary funding
right.
that can be used with service providers.
Yep.
You've got mentors that will come in and help folks. You've got tons of referrals, and you're a wealth of those kinds of referrals. What's happening behind the scenes? What is it that makes these wheels spin? Why can Spark even do this? And what has to happen to keep that happening?
It's a great question, Gene, and I think it actually gets at one of the things that I find most interesting about the role is that there's a translational role to play in terms of this world, where if you're an early stage company, you don't really understand or really even care, frankly, what's going on to be able to motivate some of the activity behind it. And the flip side is sometimes people within the public sector don't really understand how dynamic and challenged the business environment is. And so one of the interesting things about playing a space between those two, I guess, worlds is that you get to sort of translate some of those things. So, I mean, to answer your question more directly, what's driving behind it and the reason why is that the community and the state have decided that they want to try and support companies and company growth, but they want to do it in a way that is the most effective and isn't going to necessarily provide a huge amount of risk. So sometimes I think that can actually frustrate early stage companies when we have a company that comes in and says, hey, I really need funding, just give me a grant to do this and I'll go out and I'll make the best of it. And for better or worse, that's really a bet to be able to play on some of these companies. And sometimes it might hit big and someone would do really well, but more often than not, just like any other idea, you give it a go and see where it goes. And then at some point it might not last beyond an initial idea stage. So the best practice scenario that's come out of that is to say, okay, let's try and sort of spread our chips a few different ways. What's an effective way that we can try and support? Let's be able to put in some funding or be able to pay for some service providers and help de-risk the opportunity, help some of these early stage companies overcome some common barriers that they might be facing, and then try and provide some assistance in that way, as opposed to some other places, and it gets compared, right? Other countries, Europe or even Canada has like a little bit more of a direct industrial policy, they call it. They're going to try and do a little bit more direct services, and that works for them. But we've decided, for better or worse here, that we want to try and do things slightly different way. And so it takes a little bit of a discussion with folks sometimes for them to understand that. And some people might disagree with the approach, but we're sort of in the middle of trying to provide that service. So we can't always disagree with all the different components, but there's a little bit of that effort behind the scenes of just trying to say, we want to try and support early stage business growth. How do we do that most effectively?
And of course, Spark is, you guys do tranche things. You look at it, it's not like, oh, look, here's free money for you for the taking. You're actually engaged, asking, do we think this is, going to be good money after good money, or is it going to be good money after bad money? Which I think
exactly,
can be hard to accept sometimes.
Right, exactly. And I think it's been something that, everyone sort of learns over time. And I'll give you an example. You sort of mentioned the boot camp. When boot camp first started for us, it was really a business plan creation sort of approach. So here's 10 weeks for founders to get together and really focus on their business plans, like all the elements of what makes a business sort of tick. And over time, we realized that I learned a couple things. One is that you need a couple co-founders at least in order to have a really effective company. It's very difficult for just a single person to be able to carry all that needs to be done as part of an organization. So we really focused on having multiple co-founders as part of that effort. And then we also really focused to say, here's 10 weeks, not to focus on your business plan necessarily, but to focus on customer discovery. Because what we realized is that you can have a great idea, but if your market is 2 people and they actually aren't willing to pay for your idea or your service or your product, it's not going to be able to go anywhere. So this is really a focused area to say, let's try and give some attention to that aspect of the business, because that's the most core element. Is ultimately you have to have some revenue and be able to kind of move things forward. So it's things that you kind of learn over time, and obviously things pivot and shift in terms of what those services look like. But it's learning for everybody, I guess.
And of course, everybody, like you say, learns from it. Your mentors learn, Spark learns, but you've got that background to be able to say, okay, wait, hold on, people. What are we doing here? Let's see if we can line this up. Tell us a little more, Phil, about the makeup of Spark. One of your titles is Chief of Staff. It'd be interesting for people to know, like, how many people are there? What kinds of roles? What kind of breakdown do we have inside the organization?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's so we've got about 25 people in the organization, which for an economic development organization, I guess, is of a decent size. We're really fortunate to be able to have an amazing team that we've been able to cultivate. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out to you, make sure that we can try and continue with the fortunate people that we've got as part of the team. But we're pretty structured to really focus on a few things that I kind of mentioned. So we've got our early stage company team, our entrepreneurial services team, that's made up of folks that are really trying to provide direct services to the early stage companies and help the day-to-day movement of our incubators that we've got. So we've got one in downtown Ann Arbor and also one in downtown Ypsi. We've got the business development team, which is my team. We're focused a little bit more on on the larger stage or later stage companies, and also with our municipal partners to try and provide economic development services to them. And then we've got an awesome marketing team behind the scenes trying to be able to support the work that's being done in our backyard and trying to get the word out and help message and put on our awesome events that we have, like AC Tech 360 and our annual meeting and all that sort of good stuff. And then of course we have our admin and our back office operations. And we also are fortunate to have a funding team. So we have got Skip Sims and Mike Flanagan, who work on the Michigan Angel Fund and trying to support our early stage investments. So they've run, I think they're on their 4th angel fund now. And we just actually started something called Spark Capital, which is trying to provide some pre-seed funds to early stage companies in a way that we've done in the past. So and they do awesome work. And I think it's interesting because for that kind of getting all those folks together in a room or in the same, well, we don't get together in a room, in the virtual room, I guess, if you will. There's really a ton of experience and networks to be able to leverage where, you can understand and see how someone has developed, either been a part of a product team before and they're serial entrepreneur, now they're onto new things, or in the past, Skip's worked with someone that has done things a few different times. And those are really powerful networks and experiences to have. And I think it's one of the reasons why we work. I think we can work really effectively with folks as they're kind of going through their own development cycle.
Yeah, it's quite a breadth of resources there and experience, and much of the team's been there for a long time, which is really cool. In a little bit after our session, Phil, we're going to be talking about templates and forms and why they're not always a great thing. And one of the things that I always am referring people to Spark for is the boot camp.
Sure.
And the great resources there. And I think it's evident that it's not just a recipe, right? It's something that you guys have to take startups through and walk them through, and sort of keeping with something we're going to be talking about later. It'd be interesting to drill down for just a second on that, because number one, first of all, just tell us again so we know, when are the boot camps?
So boot camps happen twice a year. We do them in the spring and in the fall. And they are, like I said, 10-week programs, and it's really a chance to be able to apply for this really intensive time to be able to focus on, I would say, maybe post idea stage, when you've got an opportunity, there's a gem of an idea there, and you want to try and really figure out if there's something that you can try and grow and scale. And we match folks with mentors along the way. We give them a well, you mentioned sort of a framework, which could be good or bad. We give them a little bit of a framework to understand the business. And then again, like I mentioned before, sort of dive and drive into that customer discovery aspect of it to really ensure that there's a market that is ready and willing and able to pay for a product or service.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and maybe it's a little self-serving for the topic that we're talking about later. But I found it interesting. We were talking about the pitch party that's
Right.
coming up in June, and we said I want slides on these topics, and someone could be forgiven for thinking, well, if I say a few words about those topics, suddenly the question will be answered. And of course, what you guys are doing in something like the boot camp is saying, sure, there are these topics. Make sure you have each of these topics in a slide deck, but let's take you deeper and help you understand what are people expecting to see when we get to this topic, like financing or funding rounds or milestones or whatever else it is, or what your team looks like. What's gonna make that sing, and what's gonna make people just walk away and say, oh no, I don't get it. And Spark is one of the few places that I know of where you can reliably, twice a year for a decade. How long has this been going on? 15 years?
Actually, no, longer than that. I think we've had boot camp participants that have gone even from early 2000s. I mean, so even before
Wow.
Spark, there was something called the IT zone that was in place that sort of emerged and later kind of get shifted. So I think I was looking at something in our system. I think there's some boot camp participants from like 2001 somewhere in our Salesforce system. So wow.
And I just always love to emphasize that to people, that this is a place where you can go to get that kind of education about what it means behind those top level surface things.
But I think it's great. And I'm thinking back to what you were talking about before. I think in coming up, you mentioned that they're going to have like what folks are thinking about as they're considering or hearing from folks, right? Not in a particular startup, but what are those things or those ideas that you said I think were turnoffs as it relates to it. And what's great about boot camp and other places is that you have, I don't want to call it a safe place, but you have a space where people can have those conversations and be frank with them to say, listen, when you mention a buzzword 4 times and don't explain what you're talking about, it's going to you're going to come down a couple notches in terms of how serious that might be considered from a potential investor or potential customer. And sometimes you need to be able to have that feedback, and it needs to come from a source that is respected and has some authority on that. And that's what we're trying to be able to provide. We're not going to be able to understand that completely from the work that we're trying to do, but we can try and connect those dots so that there's people who have that experience, have that authority and understanding, and be able to share that sort of advice and guidance. And that's kind of the component that we're trying to work with through some things like bootcamp, for example.
It's a wonderful resource. We can't tell you how excited we are that you guys have been doing that for like 20 years now. It's pretty impressive.
I think so, yeah.
It's pretty impressive. And of course, just make sure people are aware of obviously the funding that you guys do and the tranched funding that you guys do. There was another program you just mentioned that you guys are trying to get up and running or do have up and running. Can you tell us just a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think it's Spark Capital. So really we had an opportunity. We've done pre-seed investing for a while where we're trying and basically if there's an arm's length investor that's coming in for a company, we've been able in the past to try and match dollar for dollar up to $250,000 of pre-seed funding. And we wanted to get back into that space for some time. And so we had an opportunity to do so. We had a little bit of success with some of the other companies that we had invested in the past, and we're sort of reinvesting that into this effort again. So we're just now sort of kind of rolling it out and trying to make sure that we have some opportunities. And I guess the benefit is that we have some networks already in place through things like the Michigan Angel Fund that I had mentioned before to try and do a little bit of that deal flow. But we think it's a really important space to be able to play, because as the equity markets have matured and evolved, they've sort of gone a little bit further downstream to try and support, making sure that there's positive revenue, that there's sort of operating flow. And that's created a little bit of a space with earlier stage companies where we still feel like there's an opportunity to try and support those. And so that's what we tried to say. How can we make sure that we're not trying to fill a space where there's already enough of that capital, but do something that is, in the economic development realm. So do something that might have a little bit higher risk profile than you might see, but we feel like is an important space for us to play in. So that's what we're trying to do with Spark Capital.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. Well, now that we've talked a little bit about Spark and how you got here and why you're crazy enough to keep doing it, but obviously you're doing a good job there. You guys are all awesome and you're a key player. There's a role available here. And it's maybe not. It's maybe more unique than many roles. Tell us about it.
So we've got this. I guess it would be a fairly niche position. It's called the Director of Research, and it's really sort of our. I think in the past we've sort of considered our data sort of guru. But really over time, and I've been fortunate to work with two directors of research in our, I guess we've only actually had two in our entire organization's history. Donna Sharilla was in place before, and she was sort of a longstanding member of the community. We always had this game internally. It was called Stump Donna Sharilla, basically, where you would ask her a question about a company or a place in Washtenaw County, and 9 times out of 10, she would know the answer off the top of her head. She knew it. She was an astounding person. She retired, and then for the past 5 years, we've had Alex West has been our director of research. We were fortunate enough to get her. She was Berkeley educated. Her husband came to the University of Michigan to study musicology, and she found herself here in this place, called Washtenaw County in Ann Arbor. And we were able to kind of leverage her skill set to be able to take on this role and really expand it. And what she's done for us, and really what the role is trying to not only take the data, but really drive it into something that is comprehensible and easily digestible so that people can help make informed decisions. And for us, that's either companies that are considering location or growth. So, coming up with, we'll have a prospect that comes in from out of state and they're going to be driving around to real estate tours. How do we give them a map on their phone so that they know all the different tech and life sciences companies that might be around where they're going through? So it's a little bit more, it's just a better, richer experience for them to understand the market than simply just driving around and understanding. To benchmarking the region. So the past 3 years, I guess we've taken a look at some data and said, where does our community fit in with some of these other competitive locations, and what can that inform us about our community and what the things are that we should be thinking about and trying to drive towards. And then also, how do we just try and provide some interesting visuals about what's going on in our market overall? So it's kind of this interesting realm of data, understanding, and then also being able to how to present that information effectively to people that may or may not care about these things.
That's really huge. I want the folks online to know that if you have any questions for Phil, or you want to chat about anything that Spark does or this position, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get that question to him, or type it in the Q&A chat. You had mentioned that it's a very visual position. You're looking for somebody who's really good with images and graphics and being able to think about things visually.
Yeah, I think that's really become something that is, I think in the past, right? Like data is available to everyone, right? Like we're sort of overwhelmed by that amount. What's really important as I think about this is, how do you try and make sure that you can distill something, pull out the important elements of that, and to be able to present that effectively. And usually that means through either verbal or visual means. And I think that's just become, I guess, a greater importance. So almost some graphical elements of this, trying to understand how you can have some visualization that's compelling and interesting to folks. That's really critical. And I think where this position is going to move sort of going forward is going to be, it's going to have an important element as it relates to the visualization of this topic.
Very cool. We got a question here from our friend Ken Spencer. Ken, you're live.
Yes, Phil, thanks so much. Ann Arbor SPARK, what a great place, and thankful that we have it in Ann Arbor. There is some geographic limitations, correct, with Ann Arbor SPARK and then other zones and stuff. Maybe you could clarify a little bit for everybody on that.
Yeah, happy to. So yeah, the elements of, I think, again, probably what we're most well known for is sort of the services around the early stage company support. And we are part of a smart zone network. I think that's the phrase that is often out there. And we are restricted in some ways of being able to support early stage companies that are in sort of in the city of Ann Arbor and also the city of Ypsilanti. But I think the element that we've got is trying to make sure that when someone comes to the door, that we're trying to be able to refer them and point them in the right direction of ways that they can try and get access to services if they're not directly through there. I mean, we'll often talk to folks that are outside of the region at all, right? Or they're thinking about coming to Michigan, and try and make sure that they sort of have no wrong door when they come in. So that's the geographic sort of limitations, but we want to talk to as many folks as we can. So don't let that be a limiting factor.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Great. Well, and Phil, I appreciate your coming on and chatting with us and giving us the overview. And hopefully, this is something you guys will be able to fill. It sounds like a really cool position for the right person, and not a lot of the requirements that you would think coming in the door. But you're really looking for a niche person who's got the expertise and who can really think creatively about it.
And nice people as well. But yes, that's those are always critical parts. But I appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit, and especially on no sleep, Gene. So thanks for that.
Oh, you kept me going, Phil. Phil Santer, always the energetic guy, right there in the middle of Spark, and we appreciate everything that you do.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Phil.
All right, I'll see you.
Always love Phil Santer, another great person in our community. Next up, I want to tell you our friends over at Johnson & Johnson and JLabs, Johnson & Johnson Innovation, reached out and asked if we would share the following information about their Advancing Joint Replacement Surgery QuickFire Challenge. And this is something that is giving up to a total of $50,000 in grant funding for the right companies, access to the JLabs ecosystem, and mentorship from experts at the Johnson & Johnson family of companies. Innovators are invited to submit concepts, prototypes, and developed technologies that could potentially address current technology limitations in orthopedic joint replacement surgery. The application is there. I'll read that off for you. It's kind of hard to read. jji.jnj/joint-replacement. And that's by June 18th. Here's a little bit more on it. A video from our friends. We're actually going to stop the share and reshare it just to make sure the video sound makes its way through. 1 second with that. Nice little video there from our friends at J&J. More details here. You don't have to be in a healthcare system. Entrepreneurs in and outside of healthcare. Up to $50,000 in grant funding and mentoring. Looking for things that reduce cost, increase efficiency, and improve usability, and simplify procedures. June 18th is the deadline. There's the place to sign up. Again, what's cool about this is it does not sound like you have to be in any particular startup or healthcare system or area. This is something where they're looking for good ideas in this particular niche. And if you are involved in anything having to do with joint replacement, they would love to hear from you. So please reach out to our friends at J&J. Well, like we said before, May is Medical Device Development Month at MedTech Crossroads. We've been talking about one topic per week, just trying to put a little tidbit into your minds about the development process, things that maybe don't get talked about a lot. The first week we talked about it's compelling, but does it work? And how the process of development is actually the reduction of unknowns. And you got to think about it that way for it to make any sense as you're going through the process. Last week, we talked about the real meaning of development. There's the sleep catching up with me. The real meaning of development iterations and how iterations can be planned and structured in such a way that you can learn things from them without just saying afterwards, what did we get out of that iteration? This week, we're going to talk about this topic, be objective, the meaning behind the ceremony. Let's get to it. Be objective, the meaning behind the ceremony. We popped up these figures on Easter Island because it was one of those things that people for many years looked at and said, why on earth is this here? It's so unique. It's so impressionable. It's something that has a particular look and feel, and yet we're not entirely sure why they're there. And it can turn into a feeling of almost ceremony. And that's what happens with many startups when they're going through the process, as well as mature companies, frankly, when they're going through the process of developing and documenting and trying to describe their medical innovations. It can feel like a whole bunch of terms, mumbo jumbo flying around, and frankly, ceremony. I better get the ceremony to look right so that everything will work right. And that can be a detriment because until we understand what's happening behind that perception of terms and activities, we're not going to get it right. We're not going to get clearance quickly. We're not going to get the development done quickly. We're not going to get to where we want to be. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The word objective, not just the objective of our development, but it's got another meaning that we'll talk about in just a second. But everyone understands that we're looking, we won't say we're looking forward, but we're looking towards the microscope that we know that FDA is going to put on our device. We know that FDA is coming down the road. Maybe we haven't talked to them yet, but we know that they're going to be evaluating us. And we know that they're going to want to look at our documentation. They're going to want to look at things like our quality system, like our design history file, like our submissions. Some of the places that we'll see these things are in pre-subs. You want to offer things up in a pre-sub, and you know you need documentation for that. You want to offer up a 510K or a de novo or a class 3 pre-market approval, and you know that you're going to have to submit documentation for that. You also know that down the road, the FDA may walk through your doors and hold a routine post-market audit of your company. And you kind of know instinctively that they're going to ask for documents. And you would think that the question would be, what documentation should I be keeping? But overwhelmingly, the question that we get asked is this one. Is there a template for that? Now, at surface, that sounds like a reasonable question. It sounds like a very reasonable question. And the answer, in some sense, is yes. Come into being, we can offer up a bunch of templates, that's for sure. But they aren't what you think they are. They're not the parachute that you might be looking for. And that's what we're talking about today. Or to riff on this favorite movie of ours, template, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Sorry, just had to throw that one in there. It's kind of like this. It's like the difference between something done in good faith and something done out of superstition. You know, saying, I need a template because it's the accepted form or it resembles an accepted form that we know has worked before, in which to place real, meaningful content. Well, that's a great thing. That can be great to learn from such templates. But it's kind of superstitious to say, I've got my template and I'm ready. If templates are being used as a substitute for real, meaningful content, that's a terrible thing. That's what leads to audit findings. We were talking with our friend Phil Santer from Ann Arbor SPARK earlier in this show. And he was talking to us about the boot camp that SPARK runs. Now, that's not having anything to do with the FDA per se, but it's talking about how do you develop your business? How do you develop your business plan? And if I just tell you what slides should be in your pitch deck, you're not going to know what needs to go into those slides. And so it is with templates. You got to sit down with somebody and understand, when I talk about a design history file, what should be going into that? When I talk about how to write my QMS, how's that going to work for my company? And we've got to get down to that level of granularity to really not just be deluged by audit findings when FDA comes to finally look at what we're doing. Here's two terms I want to define for you. One is local law. This isn't an FDA term, but it's one we use frequently in the industry, as well as the term objective evidence, which is a term that the agency uses. So let's talk about these two terms. The first one, local law. These are your procedures. Generally, they're according to 21 CFR 820, the quality system regulation, and more. There's other controls that are applicable to many medical device companies. But your procedure becomes your local law. FDA didn't necessarily say that you needed to do everything in it, but it's so easy to put things in. And the question is, was that what your company actually needed? Is it going to help your company to make forward progress? Or did that bloat just make it in there? And now it's something you have to abide by. Get this, what works for one big company in one medical device vertical is not going to work for a small startup company in a different vertical. It's just not going to, because there's things that that big company needs to manage their process that are just going to become bloat for the small one. How do you know what to put in and what to take out? Well, let's talk about this other term, objective evidence. Let's break it down. Evidence, something that furnishes proof, testimony specifically, something legally submitted to a tribunal to ascertain the truth of a matter. And that's very similar to how FDA uses the term for evidence, something that furnishes proof. And when we are thinking about submitting a pre-sub, when we're thinking about submitting a 510K or a de novo or some response to one of those submissions to the agency, or we're waiting for that audit to come down the road, we recognize we're going to have evidence, something that furnishes proof about a topic to the agency. What does it mean to be objective? Well, usually when used about a person or their judgment, it means it's not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. So there's controls around this evidence that you'd like to have so that you can see, maybe it's the requirement for signatures on the documents by the people that collected it. It's not just something you could have typed up and forged. Maybe it's using calibrated tools that are recorded in a certain way. Maybe it's the evidence that there's training that went into how this was collected. There's many ways that we can make evidence objective. One of the easiest is, first of all, to make it written. Let's talk about objective evidence. Here's some good objective evidence. Documents with your company's procedurally required elements, which in turn satisfy both the regulation and your business needs. That would be what objective evidence is there to do. A bad example of objective evidence would be documents which came out of one template and a procedure sourced from another template that don't even agree with each other. The procedure is asking for something, and your documentation, despite the fact that your procedure is asking for something, just ignores it and doesn't put it in. What's going to happen in an audit? They're going to look at it and they're going to say, you wrote your local law, but then you didn't follow it. We never asked you to have those elements in there, but you put them in, then you didn't follow them. And it just degrades confidence, as well as creates audit findings, as well as makes your company have to go back and do more work, whether it's in the middle of a 510K or whether it's at the in middle of sales during a post-market audit. The horrible version of objective evidence that really doesn't qualify as objective evidence is, I have that in an email somewhere. And of course, we've heard that before, where somebody types something in an email and it doesn't correspond to any procedure, doesn't correspond to the regulation, and you just hope and pray that it satisfies the agency, which in many cases it will not. Let's do, before we do a real example here, consider this. We read and are audited to regulations like 21 CFR 820. We control our work through procedures which embody for a startup our local law. And we generate tangible documents in keeping with our procedures, which constitute our objective evidence. So do you see how this works? It's not so much a template. It's not so much tell me how other companies have done this. That can be great to look at. That can be very, very helpful. But it's really regulation driven. If the regulation asks for something, we need procedures that specify we're going to give the FDA that thing and specify how our company is going to give the FDA that element. When we do that and document it with the elements we had in our procedure, we're creating good, solid, objective evidence. And that, behind all of the different things that can be done, is really the heart and soul of creating objective evidence. So it's not enough to say, oh, the engineers have that documentation somewhere. If you're a company investor or a company founder, or you're participating in a startup company, I would encourage you, when you're creating documents or saying that documents need to be created, follow this chain. How does this tie back to the regulation? And does it tie back through our procedures? And if it does, and you can show through a spot check, and this is what audits are for, internal audits, that your documents that you're creating have the elements that your procedures require, and that those elements go back either to really needed things for your business or to things that the regulations are going to need to see, then you're in pretty good shape. Let me give you a little example of this. And We brought some of the paper here, the real stuff, dead trees. I'm sorry, but I thought I'd make a point for you. Here's the section, and we're going to see if this will focus. We may need some technical help. Oh, there we go. We can see it now. This is the section out of 21 CFR 820 that talks about documents and how you control documents. It fits on a half page. You only need a half page to make it work. There it is. This is all, you don't need to be able to read it. That's all the text that FDA in 21 CFR 820 talks about when they're talking about document control. It's very, very short. Now, at N2Being, we're a company that prides ourselves on having very lean procedures. And we won't go through the details, but in about 9 pages, I've got a document here that talks about how, for projects that we're controlling for companies, how we control documents. Well, that's great. We've taken and we've expanded the regulation to a local law, and that local law is about 9 pages. I can also tell you that we've walked into companies before and seen document control procedures that stand inches thick on a table. Well, it might or might not be appropriate for that company, but I do want you to realize that your procedure needs to be more than the regulation. Let's talk about some specifics in here that a company like ours decided needed to be in there in order to be able to control things effectively. What I'm about to say satisfies many of FDA's regulations, but are nowhere specifically required for documents. In this procedure, we happen to talk about the nature of our revisions, how we label documents with revisions. And you can imagine there's many ways to label documents with revisions. We do things that are alpha revs, alphanumeric revs, and we have actual specific requirements about what those revisions can be used for. But when you read in a procedure, I'm just going to give you one example here. This is just spot checking, right? None of this is specified by the FDA. FDA didn't say any of this. But what they do say leads us to conclude that something like the following is necessary. So at one point we say, numeric released documents may not be used to produce a device intended for human use or for validation testing. Different things are said about alpha revisions. So if you were an auditor and you walked into a company like ours and you said, I'm going to spot check a document for you. I'm going to look at your objective evidence. And you see this procedure and you say, what did you use for that human clinical trial that you were looking at? And we say, oh, we used a numeric revision. Well, our local law says that we're not going to do that. It says that we're only going to use alpha revisions for that. That would be an example of the objective evidence not lining up with the local law. Doesn't mean that we necessarily violated anything that FDA said in their document control regulation. But it does mean we're now out of compliance, and it's something that we're going to have to fix. It's this chain of regulations that read and understood lead to local laws, which you can learn from templates. They're really great. That then gets embodied in objective evidence that agrees with those local laws. That's the chain you want to be following. So if you're part of a startup, again, if you're a founder or development team, or you're an investor in a startup, a medical device development startup, ask them, ask your team, do we really understand when we make a drawing, when we make a document, when we make a diagram, is that one that needs to be controlled? Is it one that needs to agree with a procedure that we have? And does that ultimately satisfy the regulation? It really is that simple. The working out takes work and it takes effort and it takes understanding. But at core, it really is that simple. And so hopefully this little walkthrough, objective evidence, it's really the core. Don't go looking for templates. They're great when you can get your hands on them, learn from them. But the real question is, did we sufficiently get from regulation to local law to objective evidence? Repeat that cycle and you'll be ready to talk to the agency at any of those stages that we just talked about. So about this or anything else, I'm going to give everyone a minute to ask your questions or make your announcements. If you have any local announcements or MedTech ecosystem announcements that you'd like us to be aware of, just raise your hand in the chat. And we will get to you if you have anything. We'll give about another 30 seconds for that. You'd be welcome to announce any local events that are happening, things you'd like the ecosystem to be aware of, or any questions about what we've just talked about here today. And not hearing any more of those, I want to thank you all for being part of MedTech Crossroads today. We'll be back with you next Friday. 2 weeks from now, be sure to tune in because our judges will be back with a nice panel session, which we'll enjoy together. And other than that, enjoy that beautiful weather out there. I'm going to get back to be with the family at the hospital, and I covet your thoughts and your prayers, and we'll see you next week. Have a great one. Bye-bye.